I am the disgrace my sister weaponized to entertain our guests, while my mother watched and said nothing.
Not a slip of the tongue. Not a mistake. It was a performance. Polished. Practiced. Perfectly timed, like everything Elise ever did. I'm about to share something personal, but first, drop your city or country in the comments. Thanksgiving, Rosemont Estate. Crystal chandeliers casting golden light over a table set for triumph. Everyone there wore the Marshall name like a badge of honor. I wore it like a scar. I wasn't supposed to speak. I knew that. I was the afterthought. The dropout. The one who'd walked away from the Marshall medical dynasty and didn't look back. But when they passed the mic, figuratively, of course, the Marshalls would never be so vulgar. I stood. I can't donate this year, I said. Public defenders don't earn much. But I give something else. My work keeps families together, saves children from broken systems. That has to count for something. Silence. And then Elise stood. My sister, the doctor, the heir, the favorite. She didn't look at me. She looked at the crowd. I think what my sister means, she said, with a voice that smiled while her words cut, is that some of us chose to honor the Marshall legacy, and some of us chose other paths. Laughter, quiet but sharp, the kind that lives under your skin for years. To purpose, she finished, raising her glass, and pride. I felt it then, the exact moment they let me go, not with a scream, not with the door slammed shut, but with that silence, that polite, careful silence that says, "We've already rewritten the story without you in it." I left. No one stopped me. Not Elise, not our father who hadn't looked at me once all evening, not our mother who sipped her wine as if it were tranquilizer. Outside, I walked into the cold with no coat, just the fire in my chest and the law book in my bag, the one my grandfather gave me the night I told him I was leaving med school. "They'll say you failed," he'd whispered, "but that's only because they're afraid of what you'll become without their rules." That night, I buried the girl who wanted to be loved by them, and I started becoming the woman they would one day have to rise for. Judge Eleanor Marshall. Disgrace, they said, until they had to say, Your Honor. The letter sat in the back of my desk drawer, untouched, unopened, but never forgotten. He'd pressed it into my palm the last time I saw him. Pale, thinner than I'd ever seen him, his hospital room thick with antiseptic and unspoken things. His hand had trembled as he tucked the envelope between my fingers like it might burn him if he held on too long. "Open this when you're ready to face them again," he'd said. I wasn't. Not then. Not for a long time. He died 3 weeks later. They buried him under stone in silence. I watched from the back row, separate from the family, just as I'd been in life. No one offered me a hand to hold. No one asked if I was okay. I wasn't. I moved through the motions of grief without shape. Buried myself in coursework. Late nights in the law library, ramen dinners, and court-appointed cases. I didn't cry. I didn't sleep much either. But I kept going. Because what else could I do? I had nothing left but forward. The envelope remained in that drawer, yellowing at the edges, tucked between dusty law outlines and unopened holiday cards from my mother. Each signed in the same careful hand. Love, Mom, as though love were something you could fake with a signature. There were nights I almost opened it. When my student loans threatened to crush me. When I saw my sister's name in another glossy magazine profile. When I came home from court and dropped my bag onto a floor that still smelled faintly of my grandfather's pipe tobacco, and realized this house was the only family I had left. But I didn't. Not until the wedding invitation arrived. Cream cardstock, gold seal, Marshall family crest staring back at me like a dare. And suddenly, the letter burned. That night, I poured a glass of my grandfather's favorite whiskey, sat at the kitchen table in his old armchair, and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. His handwriting stopped me. I hadn't seen it in years. The same looping script that had signed every birthday card with "Be exactly who you are." "Ellie," it read, "if you're reading this, I'm gone." But that also means you've survived. You've made it further than they ever believed you could, and I am so damn proud of you. When they try to reduce you, remember that your strength is not in fighting to be included, it's in becoming someone they can never ignore. Forgive them if you can, but never apologize for walking away. The family legacy isn't medicine, it's courage, and it's yours now. I didn't cry, not at first, but when I folded the letter and pressed it against my heart, something inside me broke open. Not in pain, in permission. He had seen me, even when the rest of them refused to. The radiator hissed like it was angry with me, and maybe it was. The heat barely worked, the ceiling had a stain I tried not to look at, and my upstairs neighbor practiced drums at midnight. Still, it was mine, the first space that didn't carry their voices in the walls. Law school was survival disguised as ambition. I took notes with frozen fingers, highlighted textbooks I couldn't afford to replace if I spilled coffee on them, and walked to class in shoes with worn soles. I smiled when I was called on, even when my stomach growled louder than my voice. The loans came first, then the jobs. Weekends behind a diner counter, nights shelving books at the campus library, summer shifts at a security desk where the guards barely looked at me. I learned to carry granola bars in my bag and gratitude in my silence. There wasn't room for bitterness. Bitterness was heavy, and I needed every ounce of strength for movement. My classmates talked about externships at white shoe firms and bar review trips to Paris. I counted coins for bus fare and ate store-brand cereal in a chipped bowl I'd found at a thrift shop. But I learned. God, I learned. I learned how to read between lines, not just in cases, but in people. I learned which professors would open their doors to a tired girl with fire in her eyes and which ones would close them because she didn't wear pearls. No one called. Not Elise, not my father, not my mother, unless it was a birthday or Christmas. And even then, it felt like obligation wrapped in formality. Every card was signed in the same careful script. Wishing you the best. Love, Mom. As if love could be expressed in perfectly measured lines. But I still had his book. The pages were dog-eared now, the corners soft with use. My grandfather's marginalia became a second voice in my mind. Challenge the obvious, question the powerful, protect the small. When the doubt crept in, and it always did, I'd run my fingers over his handwritten notes like scripture. Every semester I thought I'd break, and every semester I didn't. By the time I stood in my black robe at graduation, my shoes were still scuffed and my bank account was still empty. But I had earned something bigger than applause. I had rebuilt myself from rubble. Not the daughter, not the dropout, not the girl who walked away. But Eleanor Marshall, JD, the woman no one saw coming. And I hadn't even begun yet. The judge didn't smile when the verdict was read, and neither did I. Not because I wasn't elated. I was. But because in that moment, joy was too small a word. What I felt was something deeper. Something earned. Something carved out of every sleepless night, every moment I doubted I belonged in that courtroom at all. It was a landlord-tenant dispute. Simple on paper. A community center on the edge of being demolished to make way for luxury condos. But to the families who depended on it, it was everything. A place for their kids after school, a place for safety, a place for survival. Opposing counsel called it sentimental. I called it constitutional. They underestimated me from the first minute. Called me miss instead of counsel. Spoke over me in pre-trial meetings. Smirked when I cited precedent they didn't think I'd know. I knew. I knew because I had buried myself in the law library for nights at a time. Because I'd memorized zoning regulations and dug up housing equity cases from 2 decades ago. Because I wasn't just fighting for a building, I was fighting for the people who, like me, knew what it meant to be invisible. The day I walked into court, I wore my best blazer. Not because it was new. It wasn't. But because it was mine. Mine, like my words. Mine, like the strength that steadied my voice when I argued our case in front of a packed courtroom. I spoke of dignity, of displacement, of the small spaces that hold a community together when the world keeps trying to scatter them. The other attorney rolled his eyes. The judge did not. And when the ruling came down and the injunction was granted and the community center was allowed to stay, my client cried. Not the loud kind. Quiet tears, relief, gratitude. She squeezed my hand and said, "No one's ever stood up for us like that. No one ever had for me either." Not really. Outside the courthouse, I didn't cheer. I didn't jump. I just stood there with the cold October wind against my cheeks and let the weight of it settle. I had done something that mattered. Later that night, back in my apartment, I pulled my grandfather's letter from its envelope and read it again. The same line stood out, etched in his familiar, slanted hand. "There will be days when they try to make you small. Don't let them. You were never small to me." That case made headlines. Local, but enough. My name was there. Eleanor Marshall, Esquire, not daughter, not dropout, just me. And for the first time, that was enough. The robe was heavier than I expected. It wasn't the fabric, though the wool was thick, the lining dense. It was the weight of what it meant, what it cost, what it covered. I stood in front of the mirror in chambers, the black robe hanging from my shoulders, still crisp at the seams. My fingers hovered near the collar, adjusting nothing. Just grounding myself in the reality of what I had become. Judge Eleanor Marshall, 32, the youngest ever appointed in the district. Certainly the only marshal not sitting in an operating room or hospital boardroom. There was no applause, no family in the gallery, no proud eyes beaming from the front row. Just me, a nameplate, and silence. The day of the swearing in, the courthouse was full but unfamiliar. Colleagues, clerks, former professors, people who respected my work, but none who'd ever changed my diapers or called me sweetheart. My mother sent flowers. My sister sent nothing. My father, as expected, sent silence. It didn't matter. Or at least I told myself it didn't. Judge Harriet Wells had been the one to recommend me. She'd trained me, challenged me, believed in me when no one else did. The morning she placed the robe over my shoulders, she leaned in and whispered, "Your grandfather would be proud. Now make damn sure you live like it." So I did. From day one, I made it clear. My courtroom would not be a stage for arrogance or ego. Lawyers learned quickly that posturing got them nowhere. I didn't care for theatrics. I cared about fairness. About the woman fighting for custody of her son. The immigrant facing eviction. The teenager lost in a system that saw statistics instead of skin and fear and circumstance. Sometimes they still looked past me. Attorneys assuming I was a clerk. Male colleagues calling me Miss Marshall instead of judge. Older men offering unsolicited advice about handling the pressure. I handled it. Alone, but not uncertain. Because every time I sat behind that bench, I thought about the girl who had walked out of her family's Thanksgiving dinner in silence. The girl who worked nights and weekends just to afford used textbooks. The girl who never stopped hearing the word disgrace echoing behind every closed door. That girl became the one they now had to address with respect. Not because they wanted to, but because I earned it. At night, when the courthouse emptied and the echoes faded, I would sometimes run my fingers along the edges of the robe still hanging by the door. It wasn't armor. It wasn't absolution. But it was mine. And no one could take it from me now. The envelope sat like a dare on top of my morning case files. Cream-colored, thick, expensive. The kind of paper you don't just send, you announce with it. My clerk probably thought it was another gala invite, some society event from the legal circle. But I knew better the moment I saw the seal. That damn gold crest. Marshall. My fingers didn't tremble, but something inside me did. 5 years of silence, and now this? A wedding invitation? Of course it was. Elise always did love spectacle. The photo on the front showed a perfectly posed couple, her hand resting delicately on his chest, the ring a small galaxy of diamonds. The caption read, "Elise Margaret Marshall and Dr. Henry Davis request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration at Rosemont Estate." I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide if the nausea was old anger or new disbelief. Probably both. Then I saw it, tucked inside, barely noticeable. A folded note, handwritten. I recognized the slant of the cursive instantly. My mother. Ellie, please come. They don't know I sent this. I miss you. Love, Mom. That was it. No explanation, no apology, just 6 words I hadn't heard spoken aloud in half a decade. Please come. I sat at my desk, robe still draped over the back of my chair, courtroom silent behind the glass door, and let the weight of that note settle on top of everything I'd spent years building. My title, my rulings, my solitude. None of it had prepared me for the rawness of seeing her handwriting again. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Elise marrying some equally perfect surgeon, the whole family glowing like saints in designer suits, and me far away, invisible and powerful, safe. Now it was real. An open door, or a trap. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in my head, low and steady. Go when you're ready. Not before. And never just to prove a point. But I wasn't sure if I was ready. Or if this wasn't the point I'd spent years preparing to make. That night, I poured a glass of whiskey, his favorite, Old William, and placed the note beside the untouched invitation on my kitchen table. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just stared at the handwriting and let it speak louder than years of silence. Because maybe this wasn't forgiveness. Maybe it was a summons, and for the first time in years, I wasn't sure whether I'd answer. The iron gates of Rosemont stood open, but it still felt like trespassing. I hadn't been back since the night I left with frost on my breath and fire under my skin. Everything looked the same. The gravel still crunched like accusation under my heels. The white column still loomed, pristine and cold. The hedges had been trimmed to surgical precision. Elise wouldn't tolerate anything less. I parked at the edge of the circular drive, far from the other luxury vehicles lined up like trophies. I didn't want to be seen. Not yet. Maybe not at all. The front steps creaked the way they always had, but now the sound felt theatrical, like the house itself was trying to remind me who it belonged to. I ignored it and made my way around the side garden, where the marble statues still stared blankly into nothing. Everything was too still, too perfect. It made me ache. This place wasn't a home. It was a monument to reputation. The hallway inside had once held portraits of every marshal in medicine. Now, I wondered if they'd already dusted off a space for Elise and her husband-to-be. She'd always belonged in those frames. Framed, frozen, flawless. I sat on the edge of the fountain near the greenhouse. It was where my grandfather used to take me on Sunday mornings, away from lectures and expectations. He'd hand me a biscuit he'd stolen from the kitchen, wink like it was a state secret. "You're allowed to breathe out here," he'd whisper. I remembered how my feet used to dangle above the gravel, too short to touch the ground. Now I sat with both heels planted firmly, but I still didn't feel steady. The breeze shifted, a wind through the trees, a flicker of birdsong. And for just a moment, I felt the pull of it all again. The comfort, the danger, the way love and judgment were braided into every wall, every window pane. This place was haunted. Not by ghosts, not really, but by the version of me that used to live here. The one who tried so hard to earn a seat at that dinner table, who mistook silence for love, who believed if she worked hard enough, they'd finally see her. I breathed in the scent of roses and moss and history. Then I stood. I wouldn't cry here. Not for Elise. Not for what was taken. This place didn't get to have my grief. I ran my fingers over the stone edge of the fountain one last time, then walked back to my car without looking back. Let Elise have Rosemont. I had something better. I had a life I built from nothing. And it was mine. It started with a name I couldn't place and a face I hadn't studied closely enough the first time. Catherine Elizabeth Wilson. I typed it into the search bar that night, still clutching the wedding invitation like a bruise I couldn't stop pressing. She looked familiar, but I couldn't tell if it was memory or imagination. Blonde hair, intelligent eyes, the kind of polished beauty my sister always surrounded herself with. But there was something else, something softer beneath the surface. Her firm's website listed her as an attorney specializing in housing justice, community rights, and pro bono legal work. I clicked through case after case until one stopped me cold. Westside Community Center versus Hartman Properties. 8 months ago. My courtroom. I remembered now. She had stood before me, not a single note in front of her, arguing with the clarity of someone who had lived the battle, not just studied it. Her tone was respectful but unflinching. She'd cited precedent with precision, built a case on the bones of forgotten policy, and stood her ground against a firm twice her size. And I had ruled in her favor. Not because she was charming, not because of anything sentimental, because she was right. That day I'd said, "Your preparation is commendable, Ms. Wilson." She'd smiled just slightly. "Your Honor is known for expecting thorough work." That was all. No recognition, no flicker of connection. Just two professionals speaking in a language no one else in my family had ever learned. And now she was marrying Elise. My sister had found a woman I respected before I even knew who she was. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding, mind racing. Did Catherine know? Had Elise told her anything about me? Anything real? Or had she rewritten the family script, edited me out like a shameful footnote? It didn't make sense. Catherine didn't seem like the kind of woman who clung to appearances or played dumb for prestige. Not the way she'd fought for that community center. Not the way her voice had cracked, just slightly, when she spoke about eviction notices landing on doorsteps in the middle of winter. I opened the judgment file from that case and reread it, scanning the lines I had written, looking for signs. I imagined her now, reading my words again, maybe preparing for court, maybe never knowing she was quoting her future sister-in-law. Or maybe she did know. Maybe the entire wedding was a setup, a trap, a test. But as I stared at the glowing screen and her calm, confident face, I didn't feel threatened. I felt seen, even if she didn't know who I was yet. She would. Soon. The invitation sat on my kitchen table like a challenge. Cream paper, gold lettering, my sister's name printed in elegant script beside a man I had never met. The celebration would be held at Rosemont Estate, of course. Where else? Nothing less than grandeur would do when Elise was center stage. I told myself I wouldn't go. Not out loud, but in the quiet ways that mattered. I dropped the envelope in a drawer. I'd buried it under depositions and briefs and bar committee reports. I told myself I was too busy, that I didn't owe them anything, that no one wanted me there anyway. But the note from my mother said otherwise. 6 words scribbled in her careful hand. "Ellie, please come. I miss you." I'd read those words so many times I could recite the shape of them with my eyes closed. I stood at my window that night, whiskey glass in hand, watching the lights of the city flicker like questions I hadn't answered yet. It wasn't about Elise, or the wedding, or the stiff smiles of extended family who hadn't said my name in years. It was about the part of me that still wanted to be seen, and the part that knew exactly what it would cost. Pride told me to walk in head high, let them choke on my title. Let them realize all at once that the girl they dismissed had become the woman they couldn't ignore. That I'd earned more respect in my courtroom than Elise ever would in a surgical theater. Pain told me to stay away, protect the life I'd built, refuse to let old wounds tear open under chandeliers and champagne. But there was another voice, too. A quieter one. Power. Not revenge, not spectacle. Control. The chance to reclaim the space where I'd once been erased. And somewhere beneath all of that, something tender. A whisper I couldn't silence. Curiosity. Who was Catherine Wilson, really? The woman who had stood in my courtroom and earned my respect? Did she know whose shadow she was marrying into? Or was she just another carefully curated chapter in Elise's endless story of perfection? I poured another inch of whiskey, took a slow sip, and let the burn remind me I was still here. Still standing. In the morning, I pulled the envelope from the drawer, opened my laptop, typed out the shortest RSVP I'd ever written. I'll be there. Not to celebrate, not to reconcile, but to remember that I could walk into any room they built and not shrink. Because I was no longer just the sister who walked away. I was the judge who walked back in. The envelope had gone soft at the edges. The glue long dried. The corners curled inward like it had been holding its breath all these years. It had followed me through 3 apartments, 2 clerkships and 1 judgeship, always in the same drawer, always unopened, until now. I sat at the kitchen table, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of wood settling. His chair, my chair now, still smelled faintly of tobacco and lemon oil. I had cleaned the study after his funeral, but the scent never left. Like him. I held the envelope in both hands, thumbs pressed against his neat, block-lettered handwriting. For Eleanor, when you're ready. My hands trembled as I opened it. I didn't expect them to. I had read 1,000 verdicts without flinching. I'd stared down hardened lawyers without blinking. But this was different. This wasn't judgment. This was love. My Eleanor, if you're reading this, then something in you has shifted. Maybe you're on the edge of going back. Maybe you've been pushed to remember who you are. Either way, I want to remind you of the one thing I've always known. You do not have to become what they tried to shape you into. You are not a failure for choosing another path. You are fire, not fabric. You were never meant to be sewn into someone else's legacy. I blinked. Hard, but the words kept swimming. They will try to make you small. Not always with cruelty. Sometimes just with silence. With omission. That's how the proudest families rewrite history. They pretend you never existed. But hear me now. Your absence doesn't make you invisible. And your success does not have to become their punishment. Stand tall, Ellie. Not to overshadow them. Not to prove anything. But because your spine was built for more than bowing. They don't get to define who you are. You do. And if the day ever comes that you return to them, don't come for revenge. Come whole. My vision blurred. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my robe and read the final line aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. True power isn't in making others feel small. It's in standing tall without pushing them down. I folded the letter with care, as though it might break if I rushed. He'd never asked me to forgive them. He'd never told me to forget. He'd only asked me to be more than what they made me feel. And somehow, across years and silence and death, he still knew exactly what I needed to hear. The ballroom was too bright. Glass chandeliers reflected in every surface, casting the illusion of grandeur over a space that smelled faintly of over-polished wood and donor money. I kept to the edges, near the quiet tables where the real conversations happened, far from the open bar and the loud laughter of men who only remembered my title after seeing my name tag. It was a benefit for legal aid, the kind of event where appearances did more than donations, where the firm names mattered more than the causes they claimed to support. I wasn't planning to stay long. I had just taken a sip of tepid champagne when I saw her across the room. Catherine, hair pulled back in a clean knot. Black dress, minimal jewelry. She looked like someone who had chosen purpose over decoration, and I respected that more than I wanted to admit. She was talking to a senior partner I recognized, one of those old lions who still addressed young women as dear. Her shoulders were squared, her smile controlled. Professional but never apologetic. I turned, preparing to leave, when her voice cut across the chatter. Judge Marshall? I turned. Slowly. Yes? She crossed the space between us with measured steps, hand extended. Catherine Wilson, I didn't expect to see you here. Neither did I replied. Her grip was firm, her eyes clear. I just wanted to say, your ruling in the Grantham case? The one about the community housing injunction? It was brilliant. I blinked. Brilliant? She nodded. The way you balanced economic development with community stability. It was cited in our internal training just last week. Your language around restorative zoning practices was, well, inspiring. I felt the floor shift, just slightly. She didn't know. I studied her. The clean lines of her posture. The way she spoke. Not to flatter, but to share. No hesitation. No calculation. Thank you, I said carefully. That case meant a great deal to me. Catherine smiled, unaware of the storm coiling just beneath my ribs. Your work is why I pursued public interest law, she said. You're not just a judge who reads the law. You understand how it lives, how it affects people. That's rare. I couldn't speak for a moment. I could only nod. Because here she was, my sister's fiancé, standing in front of me, offering the kind of respect I had never once received from the family she was preparing to marry into. And she had no idea. No idea that I was the ghost they never mentioned, the story Elise had rewritten, the sister she'd erased. I watched Catherine walk away, back into the swirl of donors and polished smiles, and I realized something. She admired the judge, but she didn't yet know the woman. The photo album wasn't where it used to be. It had once lived on the lowest shelf of my grandfather's study, beneath tax guides and outdated medical journals. Now the space was empty, dustless, like someone had tried to erase even the imprint of it. I found it in the bottom drawer of his desk, tucked behind a stack of loose papers and an unopened box of pens. The leather cover was cracked, the spine soft from years of turning pages that no one turned anymore. I sat in his armchair and opened it. The first photo was of us at the lake. I must have been 7, James 10. We held fishing rods like swords, our faces sunburned and beaming. My braid was uneven. His sneakers were untied. We looked like children who still trusted each other. I turned the page. Christmas, matching pajamas, James holding a new microscope, me holding a book on marine biology. We sat close then, shoulders touching, his arm draped lazily over mine. Then came the school photos. Summer vacations, recitals, science fairs. And slowly, the distance grew. Each page pulled us further apart. By the time we reached my high school graduation, we weren't touching at all. James stood beside our father, tall and confident, his arms slung around their shared pride. I stood at the end of the row, beside our grandfather, smiled tight and uncertain. I flipped to the photo of my white coat ceremony, the last one. James wasn't there. Neither was our father. Just me and my grandfather, who'd insisted on taking the picture himself. He'd called it a moment worth preserving. I'd smiled, not realizing it would be the last time I'd wear that coat before folding it away for good. The rest of the album was empty. Blank pages waiting for a version of my life that never happened. No law school graduation, no courtroom victories, no swearing-in ceremony. Because in their story, that part was never written. I closed the album and sat there, the silence of the study pressing down like water. My fingers lingered on the cover, tracing the places where time had worn the leather thin. I hadn't lost James all at once. That would have been easier, cleaner. I'd lost him slowly, by inches. With every hospital round our father invited him to, with every praise I was never given, with every time I said I wanted something different and watched him choose silence over solidarity. Maybe he never hated me. Maybe he just needed to win more than he needed a sister. I slid the album back into the drawer, gently, like laying a body to rest. Some things are too heavy to carry forward, but you still remember how they felt in your hands. She chose Salvatore's. Of course she did. White tablecloths, candlelight, waiters in black vests who called her ma'am like she was royalty. A place where you could pretend nothing had ever broken, if you were good at pretending. I arrived early, not because I was eager, because I needed a few breaths alone, without her eyes watching me like I might shatter the moment I opened my mouth. She walked in precisely at 7, wrapped in a navy coat, pearl earrings still in place like armor. I stood, not out of obligation, but because it was the kind of gesture that made things bearable. "Eleanor," she said softly, and reached for my hands across the table like we hadn't let 5 years rot between us. "You look well," I said, and I meant it. But she looked smaller too, thinner, like silence had worn down more than just time. We ordered without talking much. She asked for the sea bass. I chose a glass of wine. The candle between us flickered like it wanted to whisper something neither of us knew how to say. "I've been following your career," she said once the waiter left. "The Brennan case, the reform proposals, I read everything I could find." I stared at her. Not because I didn't believe her, but because I didn't expect her to admit it out loud. You never said. Her lips parted, then closed again. I didn't know how. You always knew how to talk about Elise? I said. The words came quieter than I meant them. How to shine a spotlight on her and leave me in the shadows. She looked down, fingering the edge of her napkin. That's not true. It is. We sat in the quiet of that truth, the weight of it heavier than anything on our plates. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. Your grandfather's pocket watch, she said, sliding it across the table. James has been wearing it, but it was always meant for you. I opened it. The initials, the photo, his eyes and mine side by side. It felt like a heartbeat I hadn't realized I was missing. How did you get it? I asked. I took it, she said, and for the first time in years, there was something steel-edged in her voice. Because he never appreciated what it meant. I looked up at her, and for the briefest moment, we weren't mother and daughter anymore. We were just two women, bruised by the same man, finally telling the truth. I'm not here for reconciliation, I said. Not yet. She nodded. But you're here. And that, for now, was enough. I didn't open the box right away. It sat between us like something alive, its velvet casing too soft for how much weight it held. My mother's hands were folded in her lap now, eyes on the flickering candle between us, like maybe she regretted bringing it. Or maybe she didn't know what to say after the theft she'd just confessed. I lifted the lid slowly. The gold was dulled at the edges, smoothed by decades of use, but it still gleamed in the candlelight. The initials were still etched into the back, WJM, and when I pressed the tiny clasp, it clicked open like it remembered me. Inside was the photo I hadn't seen in years. Me, at 24, in my law school cap and gown, smiling with my grandfather beside me. His arm around my shoulders, his eyes brighter than mine, pride pouring off him like sunlight. I'd forgotten how small I'd looked next to him, how seen. My throat tightened. You said James has been wearing it? I asked. She nodded. He took it the day after the funeral. Claimed Grandpa gave it to him. I knew better. And you just took it back? Her lips curved, the hint of something almost mischievous. From his dresser. Yesterday. I stared at her. The woman who had spent years saying nothing, watching Elise hold court at family dinners like a polished queen. Now here she was, stealing watches and slipping notes into wedding invitations like a spy with a conscience. I didn't want him to have it, she said softly. He wore it like it was an accessory, not a promise. I ran my thumb over the smooth metal, remembering the way my grandfather used to wind it before bedtime, the sound of its ticking from the nightstand whenever I stayed over. It had always felt alive in his hands, like something more than a machine. He told me once, I said, voice barely there, that it would be mine when I earned my own name. My mother looked at me then. Really looked. And you did. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was sacred. Like neither of us wanted to speak too soon and ruin it. I slipped the watch into the inside pocket of my coat, where it rested against my heart like it belonged there. Because it did. James could keep the legacy. Elise could have the estate. My father could keep his silences and spotless name. This was mine. Not just the watch. The history, the choice. The permission to carry what mattered and to leave the rest behind. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like something stolen or forgotten. I felt returned. The gravel crunched beneath my heels like it resented me. I stepped out of the car slowly, straightening the emerald green dress Maya had insisted on. You need to remind them they were wrong, she'd said, and you need to do it looking like a verdict they can appeal. The estate hadn't changed. Same arching oaks, same immaculate stone paths, same house that once echoed with judgment. But I had. I walked up the path with the grace of someone who'd learned how to hide shaking hands behind a gavel. Inside, laughter floated from the east lawn, clinking glasses, polite conversation, the kind of curated joy that photographs well. It faltered when I arrived. First, it was just a hush. heads turning with practiced elegance, eyes flickering with recognition. Then came the whispers, little tremors of memory shaking the ground beneath them. Is that? Wait, isn't she the one who. She's back? I saw Elise freeze mid-laugh. My sister, always the crown jewel. Her posture stiffened as her fiancé's hand hovered awkwardly at the small of her back. She didn't look at me. Not yet. But Catherine did. She was standing near the floral arch, holding a glass of champagne, all soft lines and sincerity. When our eyes met, she smiled, genuine, surprised, and something else. Respect, admiration, maybe even relief. She walked toward me with purpose, champagne still in hand. "Your Honor," she said, her voice warm and clear enough for the silence to notice. "I didn't know you'd be here." The world stopped turning. Elise's head whipped around so fast I thought I heard her pearls snap. The look on her face was the same one she wore when we were 12 and I'd bested her at the school debate tournament. Disbelief cloaked in rage. I held Catherine's gaze. Not many people did. "But I'm so glad you are," she added softly. "I've followed your work for years." The irony was almost too much. Elise, the family star, and her fiancé was quoting me like scripture. Behind me, chairs scraped. A distant cousin dropped a fork. Somewhere near the tent, someone said, "She's a judge now?" Like it was blasphemy. "I hope this doesn't complicate anything," Catherine said, oblivious to the brewing storm. I gave a measured smile. "Don't worry, I'm quite used to complicated." And then Elise spoke, her voice thin and brittle. "You came." I turned slowly. I was invited. Our mother, standing nearby in quiet panic, clutched her glass a little tighter. Elise stepped forward. The tension in her jaw could have cut diamonds. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed, low enough for only me to hear. I leaned in, voice calm, firm. "Then you shouldn't have lied about who I became." The air cracked. The gavel had not fallen yet, but the verdict was already shifting. And I hadn't even sat down for dinner. "Your Honor?" Catherine's voice rose above the low hum of conversation like a spotlight. The champagne flute in her hand trembled just enough to send a whisper of bubbles cascading down the glass. I hadn't even made it past the welcome arch before she spotted me. She rushed over, eyes wide, face flushed with what I assumed was admiration. She stopped short just a foot away from me and gave a half curtsy, a reflex, probably, from the courtroom, where formality and power often walk hand in hand. "I had no idea you'd be here," she said breathlessly. I've followed your rulings for years. Your opinion on the Grantham housing case? Genius." It hit me then. She didn't know. The woman standing before me, beaming like a law student meeting her hero, had no idea that I was the woman her fiancé once called a disgrace. The sister Elise had erased from every story. The name never mentioned at Christmas, at birthdays, at dinner tables lined with polite lies and perfect place settings. I nodded, holding her gaze. "Thank you. That case mattered a lot. It changed how our office approached eviction defense. I based an entire brief on your precedent," she said, oblivious to the tension snapping like piano wires between us. "You're the reason I became interested in community advocacy." Behind her, Elise had frozen mid-step. Her smile pulled so tight it looked painted on. Her hand gripped a folded napkin, like it might strangle her next breath. My name lingered in the air now. Not Eleanor, not Ellie, but Your Honor, spoken aloud. A title no one in my family had ever spoken with pride. Certainly not Elise. I gave Catherine a small, tight smile. "I'm glad to hear that. You must be doing impressive work to be invited into this circle." Catherine laughed softly. "I'm just the fiancé. Elise must be proud." At that, Catherine's expression softened. "She is. She's been so supportive of my career, even when I take on cases that don't look good on paper." I turned my eyes, slowly, deliberately, to my sister. She stood stiffly near the edge of the tent, her spine straight as steel, her eyes screaming. "She's always had strong opinions," I murmured. Catherine nodded innocently. "She told me her family had complicated dynamics. I suppose all families do. My gaze didn't leave Elise. Some more than others. Catherine glanced between us, sensing something but not understanding it yet. Not fully. Anyway, she said, stepping back slightly, it's an honor to finally meet you. No, I wanted to say, it's not finally. It's not even close to beginning. But I smiled. The honor, I said, is mutual. And in that moment, my sister's perfect wedding rehearsal began to unravel. Thread by thread, courtesy of the one name she thought she had erased. I didn't know she was your sister. Catherine's voice cut through the stunned hush like a courtroom verdict. She had taken a step back, as if physical distance might help her grasp the emotional one. Her eyes flicked between me and Elise, my sister, and then to the circle of guests frozen mid-sip, mid-smile. Elise opened her mouth, then closed it again. I watched as she calculated how to minimize the damage, how to spin this. But there was no elegant exit from the truth. You told me she dropped out of medical school and disappeared, Catherine continued, her voice trembling. You said she had issues, that she cut herself off. Elise's face drained of color. Catherine. Judge Marshall, Catherine said slowly, turning to me. You're her sister. The same Judge Marshall I cited in my briefs. The one I've studied. The one I've admired. I nodded once. Yes. A low murmur spread through the tent. The relatives who had long ago adopted Elise's version of events now looked between us, their faces unreadable. Some embarrassed, some intrigued, all silent. Catherine turned to Elise. You lied. I didn't lie, Elise snapped. I just didn't think it was relevant. Not relevant? Catherine's voice cracked. You erased your sister. You erased her name, her story, her success, and now I'm supposed to marry into this? Elise's jaw clenched. She left, Catherine. She walked away from the family. From us. She walked toward herself, Catherine said, louder now, and you couldn't handle it. The words hung there. Elise looked at me, and I saw the flicker of something she hadn't shown in years. Not guilt, not regret. Fear, not of me, but of what I now represented. The narrative she built, the role I was assigned, the black sheep, the dropout, it had all just crumbled under the weight of one title. Your Honor. My mother, pale but composed, stepped beside me. Eleanor has earned every inch of the ground she stands on, she said quietly. It's time we stopped pretending otherwise. Elise's eyes darted to her. Not you two. But it was over. The mask had cracked. The version of me that Elise had fed to this crowd no longer held. Someone began whispering. Someone else gasped. I heard a champagne flute being set down too hard on a tray. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The truth had arrived, uninvited but undeniable. Elise didn't just have a sister. She had a reckoning. And I didn't need to shout or cry or storm out. I just stood there, calm and certain, as the weight of what had been hidden, finally, irreversibly, came to light. The silence was deafening. Catherine's fingers trembled as she reached for her engagement ring, the diamond catching the golden light of the rehearsal tent. Her eyes never left Elise's face, not with hatred, but with the ache of someone who had just seen the truth clearly for the first time. Slowly, deliberately, she slid the ring from her finger and placed it in Elise's hand like a verdict. I can't marry someone who lies to the people he loves. Elise opened her mouth, perhaps to defend herself, perhaps to twist the story into something manageable. But no words came. Her lips trembled, and for the first time in her life, she looked small. Not poised, not dominant, just small. You erased your sister, Catherine continued, her voice steadying now. You erased her not because she failed, but because she succeeded without your permission. The room was holding its breath. Aunt Marjorie's glass of rosé paused midair. Cousin Daniel's jaw hung open. Even our father stood still, arms at his sides, his usual commanding presence reduced to stunned immobility. I didn't know who I was marrying, Catherine said. Not really, because you made sure I couldn't. Elise finally found her voice, and it came out sharp. Catherine, don't do this here. This is exactly where it needs to happen, Catherine said. Among the people who helped you write a version of your sister that never existed. She turned to me then, her expression softening, filled with something dangerously close to regret. Your Honor, she said quietly, I'm sorry for not knowing sooner, for believing what I was told. I nodded once. There was nothing to forgive. The apology was not for me. It was for herself. Catherine looked back at Elise, who now stood frozen, clutching the ring in her palm like it burned. I'm leaving, Catherine said. And not just tonight. This wedding, this entire illusion, is over. She didn't storm out. She didn't cry. She walked away with grace, heels clicking against the stone like punctuation marks on a final sentence. She didn't look back. For a long time, no one moved. Then, somewhere near the back, someone let out a breath. A chair scraped. A murmur began to spread like wildfire through dry grass. And in the eye of that storm, Elise stood alone. No ring, no words, and for the first time, no narrative left to spin. The wedding wasn't postponed. It was undone. It happened without warning. One moment, our father was standing by the drinks table, straight-backed and impassive as ever. The next, he faltered mid-sentence, his glass slipping from his hand and shattering like crystal punctuation at the end of a sentence too long. Dad! James was the first to move, sprinting forward with the precision born of surgical reflex. I was 2 steps behind him, heels forgotten, dignity discarded. All that remained was instinct. We lowered him gently to the grass. His breath came shallow, and his face, always so composed, was pale and drawn, the mask of authority peeled away in seconds. Pulse is irregular, James muttered, checking his wrist. Looks like angina again. He looked up, and for the first time in years, his eyes met mine not with competition, but with fear. Call an ambulance, I said, already digging my phone from my clutch. We worked together without speaking, without arguing. Somewhere in the space between panic and professionalism, we fell into a rhythm, our first in years. I steadied our father's head while James monitored his vitals. His hand brushed mine once, and neither of us flinched. Maybe that was progress. When the paramedics arrived, our father waved them off weakly. Nonsense, he mumbled. Just stood too fast. But he didn't resist the stretcher. Maybe he knew, in the quiet part of his heart, that his body was finally catching up to a lifetime of expectations. James and I rode in separate cars behind the ambulance. Habit, not hostility. But in the waiting room, when the nurse asked about next of kin, we spoke in unison. His children. A beat passed. Then James glanced at me and gave the faintest of nods. In the sterility of fluorescent lights and antiseptic air, time lost its shape. James sat across from me, elbows on knees, staring at the scuffed linoleum like it held answers. I studied the same floor. We didn't speak for a long time. You were good back there, he said eventually. So were you, I replied. And it wasn't just politeness. He sighed. He's not invincible, is he? No, I said. But then again, and neither are we. His smile was small, sad. Do you think this changes anything? I thought of the ring Catherine had returned, the silence of our fractured family, the watch I carried in my jacket pocket. I think it could, he nodded. Maybe it's time. Time for what, neither of us said. But we both felt it. Something loosening between us. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a shift, a possibility. When the doctor finally told us he'd be fine, I exhaled for the first time in hours. James leaned back in his chair, eyes closing briefly. For once, we were not judge and surgeon, not rival siblings, just 2 children sitting in a hospital hallway, waiting for their father to live. The hallway lights never dimmed, not in this part of the hospital. Even at 3:17 a.m., everything was too bright, too sterile, like grief and fear couldn't survive under fluorescence. But they did. They just learned to stay quiet. James sat slouched in a plastic chair, tie loosened, jacket folded over one knee. Our mother sat 2 seats down, hands clasped in her lap, eyes distant but dry. I sat between them. No longer the buffer, not the battleground, just the missing piece finally returned. We hadn't spoken in an hour. And then James said, "He asked for you." I looked over. "When?" "Before the medication kicked in. He asked if you were here. Called you Judge Eleanor like it was some formal title he'd just learned how to pronounce." My throat tightened, but I nodded. Our mother's voice followed, soft as gauze. "He's proud of you, you know. He just doesn't know how to say it." "He doesn't have to?" I said, almost convincingly. The silence stretched again, but it was different now. No longer suffocating, just cautious. Like we were all afraid to touch the wound we'd ignored for too long. "I always thought," James began, eyes still on the floor, "that you walked away because you hated us." "I didn't," I said. "I walked away because I had to love myself more than I loved being tolerated." He flinched slightly. Not wounded, just recognizing the truth. "You didn't just survive," he said. "You became someone." "I always was someone," I replied. "You just stopped looking." Our mother's voice came next. "I looked. I just didn't know what I was seeing." She turned to me then, fully. Not as the matriarch, not as the gatekeeper of family order, but as a woman who had finally run out of things to hide behind. "I was afraid," she said. "Afraid if I defended you, I'd lose the rest of them. And I was a coward for choosing safety over you." I swallowed the ache rising in my chest. "You don't have to explain." "Yes," she said. "I do." Outside the window, the city glowed faintly. Somewhere in the distance, a siren called out. Life kept moving, even while ours sat suspended in the sterile bubble of overdue honesty. "We're broken," James said. "Maybe," I said. "But even broken things can be rebuilt." No one answered. We didn't need to. In the quiet hum of hospital hours, where time blurred and pride softened, we finally sat together. Not as versions of ourselves shaped by expectation or resentment, but as a family, flawed, tired, and for the first time in years, honest. And sometimes, that's enough to begin again. The table was smaller than the one at Rosemont. No polished mahogany, no stiff-backed chairs or silent servants hovering just out of view. Just chipped white porcelain, a vase of wildflowers from the garden, and sunlight spilling over mismatched mugs. We didn't dress for dinner. We didn't even call it that. It was morning, technically. A late breakfast, early lunch, somewhere in between. No one had planned it, and maybe that's why it worked. James brought croissants. Our mother scrambled eggs. I made coffee. No one gave orders. No one performed. We just were. The breakfast nook was warm, softened by light and time. The cushions on the bench were faded at the edges. The walls lined with family photos someone had finally stopped curating. Not just Elise in first place or James in lab coats. There was one of me tucked into the corner, 17 years old, grinning with a book in my lap and a judge's gavel printed on my t-shirt. It must have been my grandfather who took that one. James noticed me staring at it. "We've been digging through the old boxes, found a lot we'd forgotten." I hadn't forgotten, I said. Just thought no one else remembered. Our mother set down a plate and sighed. "I remembered. I just didn't know how to make it safe to show." There was no drama in her voice, no rehearsed apology, just honesty. And that somehow was heavier and kinder than any confession could have been. We ate in easy silence for a while. Butter passed hand to hand. Coffee poured without asking. No one flinched when elbows touched. "This feels strange," James said eventually, slicing a croissant. "In a good way." "It feels real," I offered. Our mother looked up. "I like real." There were no speeches, no plans to rebuild the family in sweeping gestures, just smaller ones. Like my mother laughing, really laughing, when James knocked over the orange juice. Or James asking me what books I was reading and actually listening to the answer. Or me telling them both, quietly, that I had started mentoring a young woman who reminded me a little too much of myself. When we finished eating, no one rushed to leave. We lingered in the sun, the kind that makes you forget what time it is. We talked about nothing and everything. The kind of talking that doesn't perform, doesn't correct, just connects. It wasn't the kind of family dinner I grew up with. It was better. It was a beginning, not a performance. A softness, not a spectacle. And in that sunlit room, with no legacy weighing us down, we began, slowly, imperfectly, to learn what it meant to simply belong. The office wasn't big, a converted corner of a red brick building near the train tracks, with peeling paint on the window frames and a welcome mat that had seen too many shoes. But inside, everything felt fresh. The walls were pale green, the light warm, and on the desk sat a plaque so new it still smelled of varnish. Catherine Wilson, escrow founder, Rosaline Legal Aid. She didn't choose the name for elegance. She chose it for what it meant. Resilience rooted in something once thorned, something that had bloomed despite the odds. The opening had been quiet. No ribbon cutting, no press release. Just a handful of friends, a stack of intake forms, and a single check that had made it all possible. Catherine still hadn't said anything aloud. Not to the staff, not even to Eleanor, but she knew. The envelope had arrived without a return address. The handwriting on the card was neat, familiar. The message inside was simple. For the kind of justice that matters, with quiet faith in what you'll build, M. M, as in Margaret, as in Eleanor's mother. Catherine hadn't cried when she ended the engagement. She hadn't cried when she left Rosemont, suitcase rolling behind her like a quiet rebellion. But when she read that note, sitting alone on the floor of her empty apartment with nothing but ambition and fear around her, she had wept. Not because of the money, but because someone who didn't owe her anything had believed in her anyway. Now, weeks later, she stood in her office doorway and watched her first client walk out. Free legal file in hand, face a little lighter than when she arrived. It wasn't courtroom grandeur, it wasn't prestige, but it was real, and it mattered. Later that evening, she sat behind her desk and opened her email. One new message. From a judge she knew better now, one who had once been a stranger, then an idol, then something more complicated, something closer to a friend. Subject line, congratulations. Message, I heard about Rosaline. Your voice will echo where mine cannot. I'm proud of you. E. Catherine smiled. She didn't reply right away. Some messages don't need quick answers. Some are meant to sit on your heart for a while, reminding you of who you are and who you've chosen to become. She looked out the window where the city softened into twilight and felt something settle deep in her chest. This was hers. Not borrowed, not bought, not performed. Built. And that was enough. The letter sat on the kitchen counter for a full week before James opened it. It wasn't like him to hesitate. But something about that envelope, white, international postage, addressed in his own shaky handwriting, felt heavier than paper should. When he finally did open it, the acceptance was written in clean, confident language. We are pleased to offer you a position in our next rotation. Your assignment begins June 12th, South Sudan. He stared at the words until they blurred. He wasn't running. That's what he kept telling himself. Not running from the family or the fallout of Elise's wedding unraveling like a pulled thread. Not running from the long, heavy silence that still clung to their father's hospital room, even after the machines were unhooked and the prognosis stabilized. No, he was walking toward something. That's what Eleanor had called it once, years ago, before their estrangement. Sometimes you don't leave because you hate them. You leave because you have to breathe again. He hadn't understood it then. He thought she was selfish, dramatic. But now? Now he understood. He waited until their father was napping before telling their mother. She was seated beside the window, knitting something she never finished. I'm going overseas, he said quietly. Doctors Without Borders. She looked up slowly. For how long? I don't know yet. Maybe 6 months? Maybe more. She didn't try to stop him. She didn't even flinch. She only nodded once and said, "Then I'm proud of you." He wasn't sure if it was the words or the ease with which she said them that made him exhale. Later, he told Eleanor. They met for coffee, something casual, something safe. She stirred her drink like a ritual, then raised an eyebrow when he said it. "I didn't expect that," she said. "I didn't expect to feel ready." "Are you doing it for him?" she asked. "No," he said and meant it. "I'm doing it for me." She nodded, the kind of nod only siblings share after rebuilding something they thought was gone for good. "You'll be brilliant," she said. He smiled. "Let's hope so." The morning he left, he stood outside the airport alone, duffel bag over his shoulder, passport in hand. There were no speeches, no audience, just the hum of jet engines and the feeling, foreign, electric, of doing something unapproved but entirely his. He looked up once before walking in, the sky wide and waiting. He had spent his whole life becoming his father's son. Now, finally, he would become his own man. The headstone was simple, just his name, his rank, and the years that shaped the man who had shaped me. No grand epitaph, just truth in stone. William J. Marshall, 1932, 2016. I knelt on the crisp spring grass, the morning air still damp with dew. In my hands, a freshly printed copy of my latest judicial opinion. 37 pages of law, reasoning, and justice. I had underlined one paragraph, the one that mattered most. I placed it gently at the base of the headstone. No flowers, just words. "I ruled in favor of the Community Land Trust," I said aloud, unsure why I felt the need to explain. "The city tried to bulldoze their claim. I didn't let them." The wind rustled the trees above me. Whether it was coincidence or reply, I didn't try to decide. "I quoted you," I added, almost smiling. "The line you always said to me when I doubted everything. The law should protect those who can't afford to lose. It's in the record now. Forever." I sat back on my heels, looking at the name I'd whispered to sleep as a child, the one I'd clung to in the silence of my estrangement, in the ache of erased identity. They used to say I was a disgrace. I used to believe them. But standing here now, I realized something that settled deeper than pride. I hadn't just proved them wrong. I had proved him right. He was the only one who never asked me to become someone I wasn't. The only one who saw a judge in a girl who hadn't even learned how to speak without apology. And now, years later, that girl had grown into a voice that carried weight. Not just because of title or power, but because of integrity. I reached into my coat and pulled out the pocket watch. His. Mine now. I wound it gently, the click of the gear like a heartbeat returning to rhythm. "I'm not angry anymore," I said quietly. Not at them. Not even at who I had to be to survive. There was peace in that. Not victory. Not triumph. Just a calmness that came when the battle stopped being about proving and started being about becoming. The wind picked up, lifting the corner of the printed opinion like a hand raised in approval. I stood slowly, brushing grass from my knees. The cemetery stretched around me, rows of names and stories, but only one had brought me home. "Thank you," I said to the stone, the sky, the silence. Then I turned, the sun at my back, legacy beneath my feet, and walked forward. No longer running from the past, but carrying it with honor.